What is going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel, and today we are finally going to be getting stuck back into the updated hero guides for Battlefront 2, and as you can tell by the title of this one, we are going to be starting off with Finn. Finn has seen some enormous buffs in the last 3 or 4 months. Before that, he was definitely a pretty weak character, although he did still have a few areas that he could do well in, but in his current state he's actually a really strong hero, and honestly I'd have to say he's probably up there as one of the better blaster heroes in the game. Now, Finn is a character that I haven't done a guide on in a very long time, so I did want to get him done early. And for those who do remember, on my last hero guide with Phasma, I did leave a poll asking whether you guys wanted me to redo all my other hero guides again now that a lot of things have changed, or whether you would just rather me focus on other videos. I originally wasn't really planning on redoing them, as I have already done a lot of them twice, but you guys actually voted at about 92% for the option to redo them. Now, just to double check, as maybe things have changed, I am going to leave the same poll up in the top right for you guys to vote on, so make sure to let me know if you do want me to go through and update the guides, or whether I should just move on to other stuff, because at the end of the day these videos are for you guys and not for me, so whatever the majority vote is on this one, then I'll go ahead with that option. But anyway, with all of that out of the way, we're going to get stuck straight into the guide, and we're going to start off with Finn's base stats. Now, keep in mind that almost everything in this guide was tested in arcade, and while I'm 99% sure all of these stats do transfer over to multiplayer, just bear in mind that there is always a chance that some stats may change from arcade to multiplayer, so if you see any stats that don't seem right, then that's most likely what's happened. So first off, we're going to take a look at his base HP, and he does actually have the equal lowest of every character in the game, coming in at 600 HP, which is only about 50 HP less than the Blaster Hero's average, so it's not too big of a deal. And he does also have a health buff as well, so overall his health is pretty much what you'd expect, if not a little better. On top of that, he does also have 200 health regen as well, which is again pretty much the average for the blaster users, so you can get down to about 400 HP and still be able to regen all the way back to full health. Now, his weapon of choice is his EL-16 blaster, which is fairly similar to the other EL-16s in the game. However, it does actually have a slightly faster rate of fire, which is actually only buffed a few months back. It deals roughly 45 damage to the body at range and 52 damage to the body up close, and then it deals a whopping 85 damage to the head at range and 98 damage to the head up close, which is definitely some very good damage output. It does have a fairly slow rate of fire due to the damage, although like I said it was buffed a few months back. However, the tiny spread and slow heat build up really does make up for that slower rate of fire, so overall his blaster is definitely a beastly one if you can manage to aim, which as you can probably tell in a lot of this footage is definitely not my strong suit. Now, one tip for the blaster before we do move on to his abilities is that it does seem like you need to lead your shots with it a little more than some of the others in the game. I did do some tests, and all of the EL-16 variants in the game do have a little bit of a slower bolt speed than some of the other weapons. It is a very small difference, and it's honestly barely noticeable, but it is there, so at long range this blaster does require you to aim just slightly in front of your enemies in order to land the shots. If you're a bit like me and aren't the greatest aim with this thing, then I'd recommend just heading to arcade and getting in some practice, or even just playing some HVV, as that way you do get to practice against real players, but either way the practice does pay off with this blaster. Now, moving on to his abilities, and he does actually have a fairly decent set of abilities. His ability set is really well suited to team play and helping out with objectives, and if you can make the most of these abilities, it can actually be the difference between winning and losing. His L1 ability is his Deadeye ability, and this is definitely his most deadly ability, essentially since the other two are much more on the passive side. The Deadeye ability allows Finn to lock onto the enemies one at a time and essentially just get an aimbot of sorts, as every shot you take will hit the enemy that's targeted, dealing roughly 30 damage per shot, although that does obviously vary slightly depending on the range. It lasts for 25 seconds without firing, but with each shot you take it will actually increase the speed at which it runs out, so it's hard to say how long it will last for because it is different every time, and then once it does end it'll have a 15-second cooldown before you can use it again. This ability is so useful when it comes to do or die situations. Let's say you're low on health and really need to win a 1v1 to stay alive. Activating this will all but ensure that you do win that fight, and on top of that it is also really good at hitting hard to get enemies such as Boba Fett or say any of the aerial classes. As for its weaknesses though, it does have a slow animation at the start where it won't actually allow you to shoot right away, and so although it's not really a massive deal, just be wary of that before activating it in a dangerous area. Moving on to his L1R1 ability, this one is called Big Deal, and it has a 17-second cooldown, which for what it does is actually really decent. This ability is a bit of a mixed bag. It gives both Finn and any nearby teammates 120 extra health, 25% damage reduction, no cooldown for your blaster, meaning you can essentially fire an unlimited amount of times, and it does also give a much faster ability recharge as well, which I think worked out to be about 25 to 30% faster than normal. It lasts for roughly 10 seconds before running out, at which point the damage reduction and unlimited cooldown go away. However, the health still stays for a little while and you do still get that faster recharge on your other abilities. Now, when you lay it all out like that, this ability is actually crazy good with how much it gives you and your teammates. It's perfect for helping out on objectives, and on top of that it massively increases your survivability with that added health and the slight damage reduction. Its only real downside is that it does have a little bit of a slower animation. Again, not really too much of a big deal, pardon the pun, but it is still a weakness nonetheless. Moving on now to the R1 ability, this one is called Undercover Team, and again it has a 15-second cooldown. This one makes Finn equip his Glee 44 pistol, as well as giving him increased speed, revealing enemies on the minimap and through walls, as well as keeping him and his teammates hidden from the minimap, which is definitely a pretty useful tool for a hero. The Glee 44 itself deals 42 damage per shot to the body and roughly 80 to the head, although I didn't even think to test the range drop off since it's not really meant to be used at range, so that number does vary slightly. This ability is great for helping keep you off the minimap and play more of a stealthy playstyle, and it does also help a lot when it comes to defending or attacking objectives, as you can see where the enemies are while it's active. Its only real downside is that it is currently bugged to where it actually doesn't give you that increased sprint speed all the time, if ever, to be honest, so that's definitely not great, but hopefully that will be fixed in the near future. So that's it for all of his base stats and abilities. Now we're going to move on to some of the more important stuff, starting with his best star cards for Galactic Assault. Obviously it really does come down to personal preference, so these definitely aren't the only cards that you can use, but these are just the cards that I think are the most important and most well suited cards for Galactic Assault. So the first card I'm going to recommend is his Stay Calm card, and this one makes it so that every time you kill an enemy with Deadeye, it actually increases its duration by up to 40%, essentially meaning the more kills the longer you can use it. This turns this ability from being pretty decent into being arguably one of the best in the game. It allows you to just wipe out enemy after enemy, and I've seen a lot of people getting like 15 or 16 man kill feeds with this, which is just not possible without the card. The next card I'd recommend using is his No More Running card, and this one is another one for the Deadeye ability, this time increasing the damage after you've gotten 3 kills with it, or at least that's what the card says anyway. For those who haven't seen my Mythbusters series, I did test this card out and it does actually seem to be bugged at the moment, and this card just deals that damage right away. I'm not sure if maybe it's meant to and they just forgot to change the description, or if it is a bug, but either way it is a really useful card, and even if they were to fix the card it's still really useful anyway, so the bug isn't what makes this card great anyway. Now, as for the third card, I personally don't really have one card that I only use. There are 3 cards that I've been kind of switching between, and so I'm going to just mention all 3 so that you guys can decide which one suits your playstyle the best. The first of these cards is his new card called In Charge, and this one makes it so that when Undercover Team is active, each time you get a kill or deal 100 damage to an enemy hero, it'll give you 2% damage reduction for this ability, which stacks to a maximum of 36%. So let's say you get 10 kills with his Glee 44 over the course of a few minutes, or just however long it takes. Those 10 kills will give you 20% damage reduction whenever you use Undercover Team. It all depends on how much you use that ability. If you use it a lot, then this card is a great choice, or if you don't really tend to use it, then it might be best to pick another one instead. The next card I'm going to mention is the Raise to Do One Thing card, which is another Deadeye card, and the only thing with this one is that, again, I did test this in the Mythbusters series and it doesn't actually seem to work at all. However, a lot of comments were torn, with some saying theirs didn't work either and others saying it did work, so I'd test this one out for yourself to see if it seems to make a difference, and if it does, then it might be worth it for that larger lock-on radius on the Deadeye ability. Now, lastly, his One Resistance card is also a great choice, especially if you're an objective heavy player. This one is one that I use most when it comes to playing the objective, and what it does is just reduces the cooldown of Big Deal if you affect 3 or more teammates with the ability. If you're near an objective and you're defending it, for example, there's almost always going to be 3 teammates nearby, and because of that you're going to have an almost unlimited health buff for you and your team, so this one is definitely up there with the best cards in the game when it comes to the team play. Now, like I said, these are the main cards that I'd personally recommend using. However, if you do disagree, then definitely feel free to let us all know down in the comments section, as there really is no right or wrong when it comes to something like choosing star cards. So now moving on to some of the best maps to choose Finn on when you're playing Galactic Assault, and the top 3 that I've picked are Geonosis, Hoth and Endor. Geonosis and Hoth are perfect for Finn due to his dominance at range and just how open these maps are. Hoth can be a little bit tough in the first phase just due to the vehicle spammers, but if you do make it inside, he's so well suited to defending those objectives. And then Endor is great because you can sneak around a lot with Undercover Team, and since you're on offense as the rebels, it is a little easier to survive. Now obviously this doesn't mean these are the only 3 maps that you should choose him on. He's honestly great on every map in the game pretty much, but these ones are just probably a good starting place if you're not too sure what to choose him on. Now, as for some tips for Galactic Assault, and like I mentioned earlier, Finn is a really solid objective player slash support type of character. His abilities are mostly team oriented, and if you can get yourself into an objective such as defending the second phase of Jakku or Hoth for example, then the ability to buff yourself and your teammates really can turn the tide of the game all on its own. Finn has always been great at supporting teammates even when he used to be a pretty bad character, but one thing he did lack was his ability to deal with enemies and playing that sort of Slayer type of role. Well, with all of his latest buffs and specifically the addition of passive health on kill, he's turned from a one-dimensional character into a character that can be played both aggressively as well as that team-based role. Now, if I did have to choose one or the other, I'd definitely say he's still better at that support role than he is at being a Slayer, and so that's the direction that I tend to play in. However, like I said, if you are confident enough, you can still play that Slayer role extremely well. In terms of the support playstyle, something that I'd recommend doing is just constantly using both the Big Deal and the Undercover Team in tandem. Pretty much just switching between the two constantly if you're either attacking or defending an objective, because when you use one then use the other one, the first one is generally going to be cooled down not long after the second one runs out, so it's almost as if you can just permanently have one or the other active. Big Deal is obviously a pretty awesome ability like I mentioned earlier. The amount of different buffs it gives you and your team is insane. However, I do actually think that Undercover Team is actually a little bit underrated and underused. Most people tend not to like it just mainly due to the switch in the blaster, and that's absolutely fair enough as everyone does have different preferences when it comes to blasters, but for me the ability to remove yourself from the minimap is just so much more useful than I ever realised. Plus it also reveals enemies as well, so if you don't use it often I'd definitely recommend getting used to the blaster because the other effects are honestly just as good as Big Deal. Now, the last tip I have for Finn really just comes down to situational awareness in Galactic Assault. Finn is obviously great in some areas such as defending objectives and using long lines of sight, but he's also not great in certain areas either, such as really close quarters gameplay. Not to say that you can't do well, but it's just definitely not his strong suit. Because of this, the thing you've got to keep in mind is to always be aware of your surroundings, both where you are on the map as well as if there are enemy heroes nearby, as well as even whether there are any teammates nearby, because Finn on his own is just not as good as Finn when he's surrounded by 5 buffed teammates with damage reduction and unlimited blaster bolts. Always be aware of where you are and where you need to be. Make the most of Big Deal to help your teammates, which like I said helps you just as much, and then use Undercover Team whenever necessary to escape from the minimap and relocate in another strong area. Finn really can be hard to get used to in Galactic Assault, but with some of these tips and hopefully a lot of practice, you guys can improve your Finn gameplay overall. So that is going to be it for the Galactic Assault tips. Now we're going to move on to some tips for the Hero vs Villain game mode. So starting off with the best star cards, the first card is the same as the GA cards, and this is his Stay Calm card, which again increases the duration with each kill. Now I know what you're thinking, this doesn't sound all that great for HVV since it's not like you're going to get a heap of kills in a row all that often, but oftentimes that extra 40% from one kill can then also allow you to get that second follow-up kill more often than not, and even sometimes a third if you are playing with your teammates and tackling a whole group at once. Not only that, but Finn also just doesn't have the best cards either, so that's my reasoning for why I use it. Doesn't at all mean it's the best to use, but at the end of the day I'm only going to recommend cards that I've got experience with. I'll never really recommend cards just because they sound better on paper or anything like that, so keep that in mind. It might not be perfectly suited, but it can often help get that extra kill, which in the long run does help your team a whole lot. The second card again is the No More Running card, which adds that extra damage, and this one is pretty self-explanatory, so there's not too much to cover here. As for the third card, for me it's the Come Get It card, which increases Big Deal's active time with each headshot, which helps you and your team a lot considering headshots are actually pretty easy to get on Saber users. If you aren't a fan of this card though, it might be worth trying the Raise to Do One Thing card that I mentioned earlier, but again I honestly can't say whether this one even works or not, so it comes down to whether or not it seems to work for you. Now, moving on to some tips for the hero game modes, and if I'm going to be honest, most of it can be transferred straight from the GA tips, so I won't cover too much, but I will just touch on what I already mentioned. Finn is such a good support player in the hero modes. We all know that hero abilities are probably one of the most important aspects to doing well, and so that Big Deal ability giving your teammates faster cooldowns on top of the health buff and the damage reduction can honestly turn a pretty close game into a pretty easy game just from playing that support role. His blaster is also really powerful if he can hit your targets, and so on top of that he can also do really well on his own too, but Finn surrounded by teammates is easily the best Finn like I said earlier, and so it's always a good idea to try and stick near your squad. Now, as for some characters to look out for, Vader, Kylo, and I'd say Dooku are probably the three main characters that you need to keep an eye on in HVV and Hero Showdown. Vader is obviously a little bit of a tank, and his choke, slash, and saber throw combination can all but win that 1v1 battle, so if you do come across a Vader, then it is good to try and keep your distance and just deal as much damage as you can before he gets too close. Kylo is pretty much the same. His freeze and pull combined with his frenzy is absolutely dominant up close, and then for Dooku it's honestly just his duelist ability. If he gets close enough to you without noticing, activates the duelist ability and then swing spams, there's honestly nothing you can do. So all of these characters can be dealt with, but definitely just make sure to keep an eye out for them. So that is going to be it for our Finn hero guide, guys. It definitely feels good to be back making these guides, as it is pretty much where it all started for me, but like I said earlier, definitely let me know if you do want me to go ahead with them or if you would rather me focus on other things. If you did enjoy the video, guys, then make sure to leave a like down below. Not only does it help support the channel, but it does also show me that you guys do want to see more of these updated hero guides. If I do go ahead with more guides, then feel free to leave a comment down below which character you would like to see next, and I'll try and do my best to get onto that as fast as possible. If you are new to the channel, then feel free to subscribe and turn on your notifications so you don't miss out on any more Battlefront 2 videos or live streams. Thank you all so much for watching. You guys have a great day, and I'll catch you all in the next one.
Should know. I'm a big deal in the Resistance.